Hi there. This is a presentation entitled The Rules to the Game of Business. What's it all about? How far can we push things? And why do we have these terms stewardship and governance? So it starts off like this. In South Africa, we have a bit of a time bomb today. We've got growth rates which are very slow. They've gone from being above 4% prior to 2009 to around about 1% today. And we have people talking about a different way of living. An example of this might be Thomas Piketty and his new book, Capital in the 21st Century. And one has to look at this and say, what's it all about? What is the company's responsibility in all that we are doing? Many company leaders are saying, well, it's up to the state to provide for those who haven't got. They're doing that by way of taxation. We must get on with doing business. But the ticking time bomb you've got to talk about in South Africa today. So let's go by Cape Town economist Murray Leibbrandt. He says, at the start of apartheid in 1948, the top 1% earners of South Africa owned 20% of the income. And by the dawn of the new South Africa, i.e. the end of apartheid, the top 1% owned only 10% of the income of South Africa. But today we're back where we started, where the top 1% are owning more than 20% of the income again. And it's getting worse. And there are those that say if we carry on like this, it's not sustainable. Now, sustainable is a term that we're going to come across over and over again in the course of these lectures. We see it as leadership in sustainability is the logo of the Rhodes Business School, and we've got to understand what it's all about. And what it's about is really this, that South Africa has been fighting about the Nkandla debacle for the last 2,000 days. But during that time, about 1.2 million babies have been born. That's enough to fill the stadium in Johannesburg about 60 times over. Now that's maybe a ridiculous way of looking at it. But what we're saying is there is a baby shower going on in South Africa where the population is growing very quickly. But
our good friends, the opposition.
But our eyes off the ball on where the problem goes. If we look at the grey line in that graph, what we are saying is that South Africa's population was supposed to level off. That was per the actuarial assessment of the Association of Actuaries in 2008. What we're finding today is that simply hasn't happened, and that the population is continuing to grow at a very rapid rate. By 2030 alone, the population will have grown to 64 million, which is 6 million beyond what is estimated in the National Development Plan. How are we going to look after all of those people? When confronted with these sort of figures, some say that the grant system will never be able to cope. Now, in South Africa, we have grants for children and for old people and for those with disability. But what we are seeing after many years of having the grant system is that its effect on GDP is diminishing. We can cope with the grants for old people and young people. The problem that we are getting is those in the middle. The age group, in this case 15 to 64, which is growing and growing and growing. And we know that in South Africa, you look at your 19th birthday present for many is that your child grant stops, your education system is under real strain, and your youth unemployment is rampant. So what's the outlook for those people? What are we doing about it? So not even Piketty has an answer for that. He says he is looking at populations which are not growing in his research. So if we look at France in 1945, there were about 45 million Frenchmen left. That grew to about 70 million today. While South Africa only had 6 million people living here in 1945, and we're up to 55 million today and counting. So we have an enormous population growth in South Africa, which there's very little that one can do to stop it. but your economic growth rate is not matching your birth rate and your population growth rate. Now, some of you will remember this chap, Trevor Manuel. He was South Africa's Minister of Finance for 13 years. He resigned in 2009 and went off to do a few other things. But while he was Minister of Finance, he was extremely popular. And the reason for this was that tax collections during the Manuel era were greater than state expenditure. We were doing very well, we looked very fiscally prudent, and that was all just fine. The problem with Manuel was that he never created a plan B. Now, the plan B is what happens when it all goes wrong. And it all did go wrong in the financial crisis of 2009, where very quickly state expenditure overtook tax collections. And we've been trying to deal with that problem ever since. Initially, we hoped it would be a short-term phenomenon and that South Africa would come screaming back. It just didn't happen. So for the last 8 or 9 years, South Africa has been under a bit of fiscal austerity, where they've been saying curb state expenditure to keep the international rating agencies happy, but at the same time, they're not delivering. So what we are seeing is that due to the reduction in tax collections, whereas it was forecast that South Africa's national debt would start decreasing by 2015. It got worse in 2013, those are the predictions, and by 2014 it was not sustainable. Our debt trajectory had become never-ending. That had to be leveled off, and we get Nande Nene, who introduced a fiscal austerity package back on 22 October 2014. Now, you've got to look at that as being an admission we can't cope and that we are not addressing the problems and the sustainability issues on South Africa if we're not going to invest in the future. So what happened right through the Nene era was that he sought to take South Africa's debt trajectory, which had vastly increased, and flatten it off. And we've been working at that ever since. Pravin Gordhan came back in December 2015. He produced his first budget back in February 2016. And he's playing the same games where he's saying our debt position is at its worst position at 157 billion rand per annum, or about 3.9% of GDP. He says we'll improve that in years to come. But how's he going to do that? And that's the big question. What we're saying is South Africa has improved its debt trajectory slightly. But there is the prediction in 2014, and we're still slightly above that. And we are waiting for the hammer to fall on this issue of a downgrade. So, is this enough to save South Africa from junk status? National Treasury believes so. They reckon that they overestimated the slippage of taxation collections back in 2014, and that in fact the predictions of national debt, there's the national debt projection of 2014, and we can see that subsequent projections are a whole lot better. But that's not addressing the issue. The issue is, how much money are we investing in our future? So when we take other ratios that they're quite keen on, like the tax buoyancy ratio, that type of thing, they say it's not that bad. But the problem is that it's not that good either. So, South Africa is financed by only 3 major taxes. Those taxes go up every year. That is personal tax, VAT, and corporate tax. And that is all your government has got to work with, really. The other taxes come much, much lower down the pyramid of tax collections. They don't make a huge amount of difference, despite the sensation that we might have around the implementation of the likes of carbon tax and sugar tax and all the rest of it. They are tiny tax collections relating to the major thing. So what are we saying with it? We are saying, and here comes the major point, the population dynamics of South Africa are such that if we're going to keep everybody secure, we are going to have to create 9 million jobs in the next 50 years. And if we don't, well then possibly we will have social chaos in South Africa. Now, who is charged with creating those 9 million jobs is basically government. But government cannot do it on its own. One of the failures of the Mbeki administration was that Mbeki said, I'm driving this bus, don't you worry, I've got it all under control here. He didn't. And now we've got to a position that we really need to get on and moving with making South Africa sustainable for all. And this is going to involve the private sector. So now we get to the basis of governance. So we introduce a character, long since dead, Milton Friedman. 1962, he publishes a book called Capitalism and Freedom. And that was an international bestseller and made him the economist laureate of the time. Now, we must take it that world leaders follow the top economists and what they are thinking. And Friedman came out with some very conservative views on corporate governance. He said, the best economic climate in which a business can exist is a privatized and deregulated one. That increases competition, which increases quality and reduces prices. We're right within there. That's straight Adam Smith's invisible hand. We must just let everybody do their thing, and we mustn't interfere. But then he goes for the absolutely controversial line, which features so much in the start of the stewardship and governance debate. There is one and only one social responsibility of business, and that is to use its resources and its activities to increase its profits. They're saying there is no other objective in business. Now, to be fair, Friedman did go on and say, so long as it does it within the rules of the game, which is to say it conducts its business in open and free competition without deception or fraud. So what Friedman is really saying there is you must obey the rules. That is your only responsibility in the stewardship and governance of companies. Are you within the law? Now, Milton Friedman managed to sell his policies to the likes of Reagan and Thatcher. They thought this was marvelous stuff, particularly unregulated open competition. And so they took it on, and Friedman dominated world economics right through the 1980s. Up until we get to 2003-04, where we see the Enron debacle. And what we see in the Enron debacle is that there may be laws there, but they are open to very liberal interpretation by unscrupulous business. And so they just went for it. And they created a whole stack of cards which came screaming down, leaving everybody out of a job and massive losses all around. That did not go away in 2003, 2004. In fact, it came back to hit us in the financial crisis. And there we see the Lehman Brothers sign being sold off at an auction to go and sit in somebody's pub. And that might be the lighter side of the story, but for many others it meant that they lost their jobs. More recently in business, we're having a massive debate about the IT companies and the question of their taxes, where we say they go into companies all over the world using the internet. They do massive business, but they don't pay taxes there. And they're able to set up tax schemes around the world involving islands and low tax jurisdictions and pay a negligible amount of tax. Now, if one looks at that debate, we can go back nearly 100 years to the Asia Pullman Motor Services case, where they said, look, it is trite law that His Majesty's subjects are free if they can to make their arrangements to get around the taxing acts. They incur no penalties and, strictly speaking, no moral censure if, having considered the lines drawn by the legislature for imposing taxes, they make it their business to walk outside them. So what they're saying is, look, this is like a one-sided game of poker. The government writes the laws and deals the cards. And if you can play them so skillfully that you win, then that's your good luck. But what is happening today is that society is no longer accepting that. They're saying, forget what it says in the law, we want more of a contribution from our companies. And consequently, what Lord Clyde may have had to say nearly 100 years ago is basically irrelevant. And we want to see a greater contribution in what is going on. So, what do they say? They're saying, when we established companies and shareholders, we said that is the only relationship that we need to concern ourselves with. Now they are saying, there's a new person in the room, and that is the stakeholder. And we must listen to what the stakeholder is saying to companies, in addition to keeping shareholders happy. So what we are saying is that we have the stakeholder. He's the elephant in the room, or outside the room. I love this picture because it demonstrates what it's all about. The elephant doesn't own the business of the game ranch. He's just there. But without him, there's no business. And what he's saying is, I'm here, and I'd like you to treat me fairly. I'd like to have a drink out of the pool every now and again, and I don't want to be prosecuted for that. I want you to keep me safe while you are conducting your business. This is where Professor Henry Mintzberg and others make some useful statements. They say corporations are economic entities, to be sure, but they also are social institutions that must justify their existence by overall contribution to society. So, now we have to look at business decisions. How do they work? So you put up a spectrum, the efficiency spectrum. And when one looks at the old way of doing business and studying MBAs, we said we are looking for efficiency. We're looking for the right-hand corner. But now we have to bring into it the social spectrum as well. We have to say it's not only about making profits, it's also about fairness in doing business. Now, if you're clever with PowerPoint, you can say, well, apart from just marking off on spectrums, why don't we just invert it, make it like that, and get a little bit clever about this whole thing? So what we are saying is, the old type of leadership may be represented by Donald Trump and David Cameron, recently departed as the Prime Minister of England. They are looking for efficiency above all else, but that's not sustainable. There's a new movement, maybe brought along by the likes of Thomas Piketty, who say you also have to be socially fair, otherwise society is not going to tolerate it. We've seen a lot of this in Bernie Sanders' attempt to gain the Democratic Party nomination in the US presidential races. What he's been saying is, let's start talking about things like fees must fall and a fairer treatment where the wealthy are not just this tiny group up the top who own everything. And this is starting to gain traction, which is why the likes of Sanders have made such inroads on the likes of Hillary Clinton. So we take that and we say, right, the benchmark where we used to be was where we made profits and obeyed the law. Best practice is out there in the right-hand corner, which represents being profitable and socially fair. That is what corporate governance is all about. The Clintons have yet to understand this, and we'll have to see what comes in the new administration, but it's going to be a very interesting time. So there's your spectrum. Where we were was to say, right, a business must be legal and it can't make losses. Other than that, you can do what you want in the green area up the top. That's effectively what Friedman was saying. We have to take it that a business must be legal. We can't say that something's socially right or legally wrong. And this has come from our constitutional court in the recent Cool Ideas case. It says, it cannot be expected that a court of law in such circumstances would disregard a clear statutory prohibition. That would be invading the principle of legality and the rule of law and would undermine the legislation. So when we get into debates about things being morally right but legally wrong, that's not a debate at all, actually. It's a non-starter. Where something is morally right and legally wrong, then we have to say, come on, change the law or challenge the existing law in terms of the South African Constitution. Now what we're doing is we're saying we want to move the upright cursor to the right. We are saying for business to be right today, it must be legal, morally right and fair, as well as being profitable. And that narrows down the field of business. And we have to say, well, what did Milton Friedman say about that? And he might have been appalled. On the other hand, he might have turned around and said, well, that's exactly what I'm talking about. If the stakeholder wants to choose that it doesn't want to do business with the company because it's not acting in an equitable manner, then that is the stakeholder's right to do so. That's a debate that we can explore for some time to come. So what we are saying from this whole exercise is that we have to create a business society which is morally right and legal and profitable. To do that, we need to look at the economics. That's a big part of what we are doing. So sustainable organizations need to live up to the expectations of shareholders. That's fair enough. That hasn't gone away completely. It still remains a high priority of business. But we also have to look at ethics. Ethics didn't used to enter the debate. In the past, we only analyzed whether something was legal or not. Now we are up at balancing the demands of shareholders against the expectations of stakeholders, or how much profit are you making versus the true cost of making it. Next up, we have to bring the ecology into it. Future leaders must look at the world in an integrated, analytic, and critical way. And then finally, bringing in the equity debate, organizations operate effectively if leaders know and understand fundamental practices and functions. Now, this is a big change because in the past, management was purely looking at profit. So we put all of that together in a pinwheel today, and these underline the values of the Rhodes Business School, where we are looking for core management skills and functions, responsible leadership and governance, the business and moral case for sustainability, and thought leadership and research. Those are your core functions. That's why we've put it together like that. Right, so we'll continue along this game and have a look at how governance has changed and how we are looking at doing possibly a kinder type of business today. Join me in the next lecture.